Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.
This is Breakthrough News, and you are watching the Freedom Side. I am one of your hosts, Eugene Puryear, here as always, alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, good to be back with you.
Eugene, it's good to be back on with you.
Good.
Should I do it?
I feel if you don't, it would be weird.
You see my hand?
I don't see your hand.
Wait, where? Why? There it is! Me and Eugene are sitting next to each other, you guys.
Yeah, and now there's a little, you missed it. There's a little bit of a delay, so we couldn't see Rania's hand. Got worried there. Perhaps there was a ghost. But nonetheless, here we are, end of the year show. This will be our last Freedom Side of this year, 2023. It feels like 5 years packed into one. So many different things have happened, and we're going to swing around and review a number of them, as well as continue to discuss current events and things that are happening with Palestine. Obviously, things connected to Palestine, like Yemen, a year in review in terms of many of the things that have happened in the United States. We'll also, of course, be touching on the ongoing crisis in the Sudan, which is continuing to deepen. It is something we all should continue to watch. So there is a lot here for you on the show. So as always, this would be a great time for you to let whoever is following you follow us by alerting them somehow. Retweet our graphic if you're on Twitter. I'm not on Instagram, but do whatever you got to do to share it there. Yell out the window, beep a car horn, whatever it takes. And since you're already here on YouTube, make sure you hit subscribe. So you are subscribed to all the great content that we have, and hit the bell so that you can get the alerts for the things that you have subscribed to, just to try to make it easy for yourself to get all of our great content like Dispatches with Rania Khalek. Great show.
That's me. That's me. I'm Rania Khalek. And also, Eugene,
yes.
I just want to remind people that they should support our show, as always, by becoming members at patreon.com/breakthrough news. And they should also like the show because it helps boost us in the algorithm. So make sure you like the show, make sure you're subscribed, become a member at patreon.com/breakthrough news, get access to exclusive content and really cool merch. Like, I've always wanted to do this live. I haven't been able to do this yet.
Right, of course.
Yeah, with this cool Breakthrough News mug. I love it.
There it is.
Very happy.
Well, let's go ahead and just get right into our first story, critical story, and that is what is happening in Sudan. Millions of people displaced, horrible humanitarian crisis on a number of different fronts as the war continues to rage there, civil war of sorts. We are very, very honored to be joined as we continue the show by Mossab Baba, who is a researcher on Sudan. Mossab, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, thank you guys for having me on. Really appreciate
it.
A big fan of the show.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that. And really, it's great to have you here. Critical story. This week, a lot of things have happened in a way. I mean, we had the anniversary, of course, of the December Revolution on the 19th. We've had the fall of Wad Madani, which, is a major event this week. So maybe just to give a capsule view here of where we are in the conflict, where are we in terms of the humanitarian crisis, as well as the state of the war itself, and then maybe we can get into some of the background as we move through it.
Yeah, sure. Just to give kind of a snapshot of where things are right now, this is possibly the most underreported conflict that's going on right now. Of course, the magnitude of other conflicts, Gaza, and Ukraine and everything are a lot more intense, but this has been kind of, brewing for a while, but the effects of it, we have about 6.9 million people displaced right now. And that's basically because this is pretty much almost a complete breakdown of the post-colonial state in Sudan. Since independence, there's been a lot of wars with a lot higher casualties, but over a longer period of time, where we're talking about the war on South Sudan, that was about 20 years. It was about 2 to 3 million people killed. You had Darfur in 2003. It was about 300,000 or so, but over a period of 20 years as well. However, the effects of this war, because this is the first time the war actually happens in Khartoum. Every time, like throughout the past 40 years and even going before that, all the wars were kind of happening in the periphery. It was the Bashir regime before that, the Nimeri regime, fighting the liberation movements in South Sudan, fighting the liberation movements in the Nuba Mountains, in Darfur, and all of these areas. But this is the first time that the demographic of the center and the north actually see a live, hot war, within their vicinity. I myself am from the center of Sudan, from the Khartoum area. So it was like almost people in those regions never saw actual combat. And it's a very devastating war because these are basically Bashir's generals going to war. And with, of course, the RSF, which is, made up of what was the Janjaweed, if you remember, during the Darfur War in the 2000s. And they've basically been expanded, legitimized, and given countless resources. And they have backers like, the UAE and, their stomping grounds or the recruiting grounds actually extend throughout the Sahel. So they extend through Chad and Niger and Mali and even out to Mauritania. It's that southern Sahara that's been always neglected, extremely impoverished, and it's just very fertile ground for recruitment, militias, militarization, ISIS, Al Qaeda, like you name it. Like if you take that strip east to west from Sudan all the way out to Mauritania and Mali and these areas, you have a very long strip across Africa that's been just basically a playground. So kind of neo-colonial, resource extraction, militarization, and just chess pieces being moved around to whoever is the highest bidder, whether it's Western countries or Middle Eastern countries. So all of that kind of came to a head on April 15th, where Sudan has become kind of a militia state. Within the past 20 years or so, the professional army started kind of rolling back and it started relying on these militias to attack people, like I said, in the peripheries of Sudan. So right now, the amount of displacement, and because of the RSF, they don't rely on like state funds. They actually control a lot of gold mines and they control a lot of the livestock in Western Sudan, the trade routes, all of these things. And they've been legitimized since like 2013 into its own separate force. So this is something that's kind of been brewing for a while, but it came to its apex right now. And the humanitarian effect is pretty dire, millions that have gone into neighboring countries, internal displacement. And with the fall of Wad Madani recently on, the anniversary of the December 2019 uprising, 19th of December, actually, the 2018 uprising. But basically, Wad Madani is not a strategic place that includes a lot of the SAF and a lot of the Bashir ruling party. So it was kind of odd that they would extend into Wad Madani. But it shows kind of a precedence that, at the beginning of the war, people thought, okay, the RSF would want to like take down Khartoum and control Darfur. But now moving into Madani and moving into the east, I mean, now they're like 2 hours away from Gabarif, which is on the border with Ethiopia. So like the extension that they came, from west to Khartoum and then towards the east has kind of, started. Even Sudanese are now saying that this, it's a cliche word that we shouldn't use, but the Somalization, which is basically breaking the country up into separate areas with separate militias controlling these different areas. And when you look at the map, it's kind of crazy. There's some websites like Sudan War Monitor and some of the media that I work with, like Iron Network, that put out, maps and kind of updates on what's going on. And when you look at the map, it's, people say it might be the Libya scenario where you have, two different governments. But in Sudan, it's going to be at least four different governments because you still have some of the liberation movements holding territory in places like the Nuba Mountains and in Darfur. But this is something that nobody has seen in Sudan, like in the whole region. And that's why you see a lot of anxiety from the entire region on what's going on in Sudan, in fears of it kind of spreading over the borders. It's kind of hard to, of course, encapsulate all that in a couple of minutes. But yeah, that's kind of the situation right now. And the negotiations first started in Jeddah, of course. U.S., Saudi kind of supported negotiations to try and bring the RSF and SAF together. But it seems at this point that kind of all leverage is gone. Maybe the UAE still has leverage with the RSF. Egypt probably has some leverage with SAF. But both of the belligerents are not, they're self-funded. So they bankroll their operations from local resources in Sudan. So it's almost like, they can survive without having like a bankroll coming from outside. But it really is kind of a neo-colonial, setup. And it just so happens, it's no coincidence that, the countries that are supporting both the RSF and SAF are countries that have normalized with Israel. You know what I mean? Even Burhan and Hemeti, as recent as May, have met with the Israeli foreign minister, and they were talking about normalization. Not because they're crazy about normalization, but it's because the countries that support them were the ones that were leading the normalization. Even if you notice in the UN General Assembly, Netanyahu put up a map of the new Middle East, basically saying if it's just Saudi Arabia that's holding out, if they normalize, then this will be the map of the new Middle East. And unfortunately, Sudan was in that map, and because of those normalization efforts. So it's almost like, when an empire falls, it's pretty much, the outskirts of the empire that start crumbling first. And unfortunately, we've been in the outskirts of the empire for about 40 years right now, since the neoliberal project launched. Sudan was one of the first countries that were in the region that were squarely going along with U.S. policy, with, it was Reagan at the time, even their ideologues like Turabi. He went to the White House and met with Reagan and Bush. So it was kind of like that was the dawn of what we're seeing right now. It's kind of the crumbling of that post-colonial state.
You mentioned words like neocolonialism. You mentioned some other countries involved in various ways. You mentioned Israel, U.S., Saudi. I'm just curious, oftentimes when these types of conflicts are reported in the mainstream media, it's, often, civil war, very organic. And I'm not denying there's anything organic here, but I'm just curious, are there any outside foreign powers that are benefiting from this escalation or participating in fueling it?
So it seems from our reporting and our investigations that the benefit was kind of more before the war. If you're the UAE and you're supporting something like the RSF, you want some level of stability to be able to siphon out the gold, the livestock, start trying to make deals, set up a port on the Red Sea and stuff like that. So even these countries, they need some level of, stability in order to kind of do business with with both of these belligerents. And right now, it kind of seems that the plot has been lost. So it's been kind of a neo-colonial state where it's more, if you want to like draw a diagram, it would be basically, SAF, its strongest supporter was Sisi's military government, and the RSF's main supporter was the UAE. And Saudi was kind of Saudi Arabia had relationships with both of them because both of them were recruited to fight the Yemen war. During the Yemen war, like ever since 2014, young men in Sudan, they would get offers like, hey, if you go and fight in Yemen for 6 months, you get $30,000. that's a lot of money for an 18 or 19 or 20-year-old in Sudan. But of course, it was like, the Saudis and the UAE, they're not going to fight their wars on the ground. So where's the best recruiting ground? It's the country that's militarized entire societies. It's militarized entire tribes, entire regions. So the security sector has kind of been that ghost that's been hovering. But these countries have made a lot of money out of Sudan. If you go to the statistics, like when it comes to land grabs in Africa, Sudan is number one and South Sudan is number two. So, and that's pretty much what 40 years of, Bashir was a little bit, he was kind of flipping back and forth. He was first, very tight with Iran and with Russia and everything. Then 2014, he just flipped into the Gulf states and started trying to normalize with the West and stuff like that. So there's not a long track record, but it's like a 10-year track record of these countries actually, pretty much controlling both of these forces, and this is basically, after the fall of Bashir and everything, it was kind of a free for all. So, a lot of trips between Abu Dhabi and Khartoum, between Cairo and Khartoum. So yeah, it was very, even Sudanese, when they start looking at their situation during the uprising, they're like, we really do not control our own destiny. We don't control our security sector. We don't control the biggest economic sectors in the country. We don't control foreign relations. So what exactly is a civilian government if it doesn't control any of these aspects of the country?
Mossab, let me ask you this too as well. In the last couple of minutes we have here, I mean, obviously, I think many people prior to the war breaking out had seen the huge demonstrations, millions of people taking to the streets. I mean, where does some of the popular movements that were behind that stand, at this stage in the game?
So you had kind of a mix. Some of the resistance committees were saying, the SAF, the National Army, they're controlled a lot by like the NCP, which is kind of the Sudanese version of the Muslim Brotherhood. So we shouldn't really support them. But at the same time, we don't want the RSF to take over the entire country. I mean, the RSF is a militia through and through with an ethno kind of, ideology of like, Arab supremacy and stuff like that. So they're like, we definitely don't want them. So we're kind of forced to support the National Army. But the majority of the resistance committees are saying, hey, we went out to the streets against both of these factions. All of these factions were all part of the Bashir regime, and we wanted all of them gone. So we're not going to stand with either one of them. They have to negotiate a settlement and then hand over power to civilians, which is theoretically easy to say, but once it comes down to applying that, it's a lot more difficult. But that's kind of how the stance is split between kind of the revolutionaries who were out in the streets, who went for like years out in the streets and demanding for their rights, and it was really kind of a homegrown movement. So kind of see that shattered. A lot of this is kind of also kind of punishing that movement that was calling for a complete overhaul of the country and a complete restructuring of the security sector and justice, for all the people who've been dying throughout the past 40 years.
Mm-hmm. Well, we really appreciate you joining us here on the show and helping us sort through all this. We'll definitely bring you back in the new year because there's a lot to cover and a lot to keep covering. Mossab Baba, a researcher on Sudan, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you, Eugene. Thanks, Rania.
Well,
Yes.
Eugene, another massive conflict that definitely is not getting the attention it deserves at the moment.
Yeah.
It's really, really brutal what people are having to deal with in Sudan, and it's only getting worse. So I'm glad that we could cover that on this program. And you have covered Sudan a lot over the last couple of years.
Yes. Well, I appreciate that, and we've been able to do some stuff on our old podcast to punch out some other things. We will keep doing more and keep doing what we can to cover it. So a big shout out to Mossab and also to our friend Ahmed who helped us find Mossab. Also has been covering this fantastically. Well, we want to keep the movement moving on here, and we're going to shift gears to Palestine, where, of course, there's the ongoing genocide in Gaza. I think you could just add the West Bank in there, the ongoing genocide of Palestinian people. And as always, we are very honored to be joined here on the show by Ali Abunimah, who is the director of the Electronic Intifada. Ali, thank you so much for being back with us.
Thank you, Eugene and Rania.
Oh, you might be muted.
I'm not muted.
There we go.
Here
We can
go.
hear you. We can hear you.
Perfect.
Victory.
Okay.
Got you now.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Sorry, Ronnie.
Thank you. Thanks
Well-
for having me.
Please.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Ali. It's great to have you on. We're now reaching, we're into the third month. We're well into the third month of this genocide on Gaza. And it's just been absolutely horrific to watch. And of course, we're getting to the end of the year. We're getting towards the holidays. And I'm thinking, I know the Israelis are hoping people will get complacent and stop paying attention, but we've all continued to pay attention and the horrors just continue, one atrocity after another. I'm just curious at this point in time, this far into it, what are your general thoughts on what's taking place in Gaza right now?
Well, the first thing I want to echo is what you said, Rania. We can't take our eyes off this. Our friends in Gaza tell us every day that what gives them hope is seeing people out protesting, seeing people making noise, people demanding an immediate end to the genocide. And just yesterday, there's a new poll from Quinnipiac University that shows that support for Israel is continuing to plummet in the United States, particularly among young people, among Democrats, among people of color, particularly African Americans and Latinos, where support for, or rather opposition to sending US weapons to Israel, the weapons that are being used for this genocide, is overwhelming. 70% of people under 34 do not want US weapons sent to Israel. 60% of Black and Latino people do not want US weapons sent. And a narrow and more nationally, more Americans do not want the US sending weapons to Israel than support sending weapons. So this is something I haven't seen in my lifetime, is basically majority US public opposition to Israel and its wars. And of course, that means to the policy of the Biden administration, which is full-scale support and participation in this genocide. It could stop the massacres we're seeing. And by the way, some of the worst massacres have happened in the last 24, 48 hours. There is no slowing down by Israel. They are murdering hundreds of people a day. The vast majority of them are actually women and children. And that doesn't mean that the men are somehow fair game. The men are just as deserving, just have as much of a right to life as well. But just to give you a scale, 70% of those Israel are killing are women and children. And this is not slowing down at all. It's utterly horrifying.
Ali, one of the other things that I think is I don't know, well, surprising some people, maybe not others, is the military failures essentially by Israel. Obviously they're slaughtering a lot of people, but it seems that the resistance in Gaza, they haven't really been able to make a dent in their ability to fight back. I just wonder how you evaluate that, because it seems like a major military defeat, at least psychologically, to what Israel has always claimed it would be able to do to the Palestinians.
That's exactly right. And it's not something that's getting any coverage in US mainstream media, but the resistance in Gaza has fought Israel to a standstill. In fact, Israel has not been able to gain control of any part of Gaza. They are able to enter it. A guerrilla army can't stop tanks from entering. But what they have completely stopped them from doing is gaining secure control of any inch of Gaza. And I'll give you an example. 2 days ago, the Israeli military announced that it had achieved, quote, complete operational control over the neighborhood of Jabalia, which is over Jabalia refugee camp, which is in the north of Gaza, east of Gaza City. So this is one of the first areas that Israel entered now almost 2 months ago in terms of the ground war. And just this morning, the Qassam brigades, the military wing of Hamas, published a video, one of its many videos, showing that it easily picked off an Israeli soldier with a sniper in Jabalia. And this is the story across Gaza, north and south, where every day the resistance is publishing videos showing them destroying Israeli tanks, ambushing Israeli soldiers, and sending them home dead or injured. Whereas the Israeli army is only able to publish videos of its soldiers shooting at walls, shooting into empty rooms, shooting at empty school desks, and so on. They have not been able to achieve anything militarily. And this is an extraordinary achievement for the Palestinian resistance when you consider that Gaza has been under such a tight siege for so many years, and Israel is supposedly one of the most powerful armies in the world, and it has the full backing of the world's superpower. And Joe Biden is, just as Barack Obama did in 2014, is airlifting bombs and missiles to Israel to make sure that Israel can continue murdering children. But Israel has nothing to show militarily. They haven't achieved any of their stated goals. And of course, this is a problem because they have climbed so high up the tree in terms of what they said they would do, that climbing down now is extremely difficult, because then they have to admit defeat, which is what this is militarily speaking. Because let me be clear, when it comes to murdering unarmed civilians in their homes, in schools, in hospitals, Israel is the world champion, second to none. I don't say that as a joke, it's the absolute truth. But when it comes to fighting soldier to soldier, face to face, in the field, the Israeli army is a complete failure.
Emphasize over and over again, because Israel is very, like you said, very good. It's very easy to kill civilians. It's very easy to drop bombs on children. They can't fight back. It's a much more different situation when you're not able to achieve anything militarily. And that's what the Israelis are facing. And they're very stuck right now. But Ali, I want to turn to a different aspect of this genocide that I find extremely alarming and disturbing. And that is the gleeful hate that has consumed Israeli society. It's to the extent where they are publicizing their, they're celebrating death regularly. They're enjoying doing what they're doing to Palestinians, and they're posting videos showing it. There's Telegram channels that are glorifying dismembering Palestinians, mutilating Palestinians. You know, it's something that I think is very reminiscent of the way the KKK used to behave, and KKK families would behave in the American South. It's incredibly dangerous because there's no red lines. Can you talk a little bit about that aspect of this? It kind of reminds me, and this is not to minimize it, but it's kind of like the kid who enjoys torturing animals or something, but on a societal level and doing it to other human beings.
Yeah, it is extraordinary. I mean, some of the stuff we've seen coming out of Israel in the past couple of months is just utterly deranged beyond anything you can believe. Of course, there are the statements from top leaders calling Palestinians human animals while starving them, cutting off water and medicine, that international human rights groups and experts have said are basically prima facie evidence of genocidal intent. But when you look at the societal level, what makes this so visible is social media. This stuff was always there, but now we see it in a way we didn't before. So, for example, there was the viral song a couple of weeks ago of Israeli children singing for the annihilation of Gaza. These cute angel-faced children singing these utterly blood-curdling lyrics. We see Israelis on Instagram and TikTok celebrating Palestinians being killed, making fun of Palestinians who are being starved. Now, I think that this is, of course, very typical of settler colonial societies. We certainly saw this kind of demonization. There's a whole history. I don't need to go into the whole history of this kind of demonization of Black people in the United States or in South Africa. And in a sense, it is necessary for a settler colonial society because the level of brutality and murder and oppression that is needed to maintain such an unjust and illegitimate society requires this kind of dehumanization. And that's why you have all of these propaganda and lies. For example, they're absolutely false, and I believe now we can say that it's false claims of mass rape that that were perpetrated by Hamas. Israel has presented no credible evidence of this whatsoever. But these stories serve the same function as the accusation against Emmett Till that justified his murder, and that was always the justification for lynchings of Black men. The portrayal of the oppressed group, whether it's Palestinians or Black people or people in other parts of the world historically, certainly Native Americans in this continent, who have been demonized, who have been portrayed as brutes, who have been talked about as savages and as animals in order to facilitate their killing and to make it easy for the members of the dominant group to go out and kill them without remorse and without a conscience. And this is exactly what's happening. But I think what is slightly different about Israel is that it's all so visible on social media, and the fact that I think that Israel is so used to impunity and so used to unquestioning support from so many people that they don't think there's anything wrong with it. They're sometimes shocked when people express shock. But I think this does explain the numbers that I pointed out at the outset of this discussion of why support for Israel is plummeting in the United States to absolutely historically low levels. It's because people, ordinary people in the United States and around the world, can see Israel in a way Israel apparently can't see itself.
I think that's extraordinarily true, and it makes a lot of sense in terms of how people are seeing things for the first time, perhaps not in history, but because of social media, which leads me to the final thing I wanted to ask you too, Ali, is it feels like one of the other, I mean, it's tragic in many ways, but I think also extremely important is the voices that have come from Gaza that because of social media have been unmediated by, the CNN interviews and all that different types of things. I think so many people, especially young people, have seen this human side of Palestine in a way that the mainstream media has never wanted to bring it out.
That's right. And some of the most articulate and courageous voices are in Gaza right now. We're very proud at the Electronic Intifada that we publish every single day reporting on the ground from colleagues in Gaza. And 4 of our writers have been murdered by Israel since the beginning of this war, which just goes to show how far and wide the impact goes. One of those who was murdered was my friend Rifat al-Ar'ir, a friend to many, a wonderful man, a man of great humanity, of learning, who taught hundreds, if not thousands of people in Gaza how to write, how to tell stories, how to do reporting. And many of the writers that we publish are Rifat's students. And Rifat was assassinated by Israel on December 6th. Because he was a prominent voice on social media and in terms of his writing and doing interviews, he is one of many intellectuals and journalists. Now more than 100 journalists have been targeted and murdered by Israel in Gaza, Palestinian journalists, and they have also targeted university professors, doctors, really everyone who is part of Israel's of Gaza's intellectual and social life as part of this genocide. But those voices continue, and it's our pride and our one of the things that keeps me going is that we are able to publish these voices from Gaza every day.
Well, and I hope anyone who's not following the Electronic Intifada starts right away. Ali Abunimah, director of the Electronic Intifada, thank you as always for giving us some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Thank you.
Well, I mean, Ali's voice and
Yes.
also the voices that we hear regularly at the Electronic Intifada are so important. I encourage everybody to please make sure that you are following them on YouTube. They do regular live streams on the situation in Gaza. And I mean, I think this is such a crucial moment where media outlets like Electronic Intifada, like Breakthrough News, all of these independent media outlets are more important than ever.
Definitely, definitely. And I just want to apologize to our viewers. I'm a little under the weather here, so sorry I had
Yeah,
to
poor
wipe
Eugene.
my nose a couple times. But, you know, listen, I'm trying to make sure I don't look ridiculous on camera. But we're going to continue moving forward with the repercussions, I think you might say, of the Israeli genocide in Gaza and move to Yemen, which is becoming increasingly targeted by the United States and other powers. We are very happy to welcome back to the show Jihan Hakim, who is the chair of the Yemeni Alliance Committee. Jihan, thank you so much for being back with us.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, I don't know if you might be muted. That might be on our end. Oh,
We hear you.
we got you.
Or not.
Okay, thank you
yes,
for having me.
we do.
No, perfect. Thanks so much for coming back. And let me just ask you this. The United States has announced this new military task force to quote unquote protect the Red Sea, but it obviously seems to just be sort of a threat against Yemen, really, for their solidarity with Palestine. And I'm curious your perspective. Do you actually deter Yemen from standing down in terms of the solidarity they've been expressing?
You know, I don't think Yemenis went into this with any level of cover or safety from the US or other powers. No one has had Yemen's back, right? Their intentions were to take action to specifically stop Israel's genocide of Palestinians. Yemenis know very well what the US is capable of from personal experience. You know, they've experienced a genocide firsthand. US made bombs dropped on Yemen for over 7 years. So, you know, solidarity is not safe, right? Whether it's protesting, engaging in civil disobedience, which so many folks from around the globe are doing as we speak, because they too agree that the genocide of Palestinians is immoral and it must be stopped. Over 150 countries voted for a ceasefire. We're even hearing countries cutting off ties with Israel and booting their ambassadors from their countries. So Yemenis are merely leveraging the only position they have to speak up against Israel's actions, even if a response will come at their expense. You know, and I pray that it doesn't cost Yemen more violence and more bloodshed. If anything, Yemen is showing the world what a true ally looks like. And happy to see Malaysia's government following, their lead. And I think I'm hearing some chatter too online from Chinese warships refusing to assist, Israeli cargo ships in the Red Sea. So I think what really needs to be highlighted in this very moment is that the Biden administration has had ample time to de-escalate and work towards peace building. And instead, he quickly assembled a 10-nation coalition to directly attack the Red Sea, threatening Yemen. So when will the U.S. stand for the American people and stop engaging in endless and expensive wars in the Middle East with our taxpayer dollars?
You know, another aspect of this is the way it's portrayed. It's pretty widespread in the mainstream. It's this accusation that the Yemeni government doesn't actually represent Yemen, but actually represents a faction, this like tribal militia that seized power in a very underhanded way. How do you respond to those sorts of claims?
You know, Yemen has had factions for a very long time. In modern times, it's went back from being divided into two parts, north and south, to a unified one ruled under a 30-year dictator, Ali Abdullah Saleh. Prior to 2010, the Saudis, who used to work closely with the Houthis, who didn't even refer to them as Shia or backed by Iran, they were buddies, and then during the Arab Spring, everyone united against Ali Abdullah Saleh, the Houthis and the Islah, all the other factions in Yemen, the South and the marginalized, all Yemenis were eager for change. So the Houthis have their own history and there's a list of grievances against them. But I will say about the Houthis is that they have won the war in Yemen with no air force or navy. So some look at them as a resistance. Others look at them as, like you mentioned, a rebel group, but they consider themselves as a government of Sana'a, who have control of over 70 to 80% of Yemen, and inhabitants in those areas feel relatively safe.
One of the things I think is related to this, and you mentioned it, is this Yemen is just a proxy of Iran, and everything that's happening is just being determined by Iran, and it's just a puppet force there. And I'm curious, what you think about that, and also just even the idea that, other countries like the United States have the right to even dictate who Yemen does decide to have relationships or work with.
Yeah, we really have to remember that Yemen is a sovereign country, which essentially means that no other nation, be it Iran or the US, has the authority to control its territory. Yet we're always hearing war proponents calling the Houthis or Ansarullah Iran-backed, Iran-aligned. It's a deliberate use of language to plant hatred against Yemenis, because anytime you mention Iran, respectfully, the Middle East's supposed biggest boogie monster, it's an easy low blow to the issue. Yemen's history ever since the British Empire has proven that they don't take kindly to invasions, occupations, and any level of foreign control, even from our fellow Arab neighbors. The American public is being led to believe something that's not true. It's actually highly offensive to rob Yemen's agency and reduce their autonomy to merely being a proxy. I think Washington uses these labels largely to rationalize the U.S. support for the genocidal bombing campaign by the Saudis and the Emiratis. Yemenis rule Yemen, period.
And, Jihan, we've talked about this before, but I do think it deserves to be mentioned again. Can you talk a bit about the humanitarian situation in Yemen? Much like, Gaza, Sudan, the Congo, Yemen is one of the world's worst humanitarian crises at the moment.
Yeah, all of these humanitarian crises, we just have to remember to name them, that they're man-made. The UN says that 2/3 of the population of Yemen, that's over 20 million Yemenis, require humanitarian assistance. And over 4 million Yemenis are displaced by the war. And then the Saudi-imposed blockade of Yemen is still in place as the principal cause of the humanitarian catastrophe, denying food and medicine into the country, coupled with the World Food Program cut aid into the north of Yemen about a little over a week ago. There's a little bit of data here that's very painful for me to share, but 1 in 5 Yemeni children could starve to death. That is a very painful and slow death that is preventable. Food is being used to collectively punish a people, and it's happening in Gaza as well. We hear about the role of the U.S. In Sudan and the Congo. And Israel has hands in all of those places as well. And I think it's important to remember, if folks take away anything today, is that the U.S. is actively involved, is arming factions, is profiting from the bloodshed of our families' homelands. And these issues are American problems. Their taxpayer dollars, our taxpayer dollars are invested and spent on violence under the guise of more jobs, democratization, or fighting, quote unquote, fighting terrorism. So I really want folks to remember that you have the power to vote the right way, contact your reps, and follow groups led by communities that are directly impacted by these issues. Get involved, but be careful when you get involved, because as Al-Hajj Malika Shabazz said, that if you're not careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people who are being oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppressing. So I really want folks to remember that this is not a faraway issue. It's happening over there. This issue is our issue. It's an American problem.
No, I think that's a very well taken point. And on that note, where can folks find the work you all are doing in the Yemeni Alliance Committee if they're looking to find out more and learn how they can advocate?
Yes, please follow us on Instagram or Twitter, Yemeni Alliance Committee. We actually have a letter out to Biden that we want to push out tomorrow. So I encourage organizations to get in touch with us.
Excellent. Right on. Jihan Hakim, Chair of the Yemeni Alliance Committee, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.
Well, yes. Yemen, the poorest country in the region,
yes,
stepping up to support Palestine, while the richest countries in the region sit on their hands.
It's
I don't know.
It's honestly amazing, really, to see. And it's if people follow the statements from the Yemeni government, which I hope you do. We try to get some of them up on Breakthrough News when we can. But I mean, they're basically just like, we don't care. Like, do whatever you want to do. Like, you want to attack us, attack us. You want to come for us, come for us. Like, we're going to do what we're doing for Gaza because it's the right thing to do. And whatever the repercussions may be, we're not going to stop. There's a lot of interesting elements too. I mean, they're calling on Saudi Arabia to open up a land bridge so that they can send troops to Gaza. And there's tens of thousands of people across Yemen who have volunteered. The same is also true, by the way, of many Iraqis. So you can see that Yemen seems to be the only government in the region that has developed a framework by which to show solidarity. And I think, the Red Sea is basically closed at this point. And some of that too, I do want to say, I think it's relevant before we move to our next guest. Some of it does seem to me, Rania, to be designed to also increase this demonization of Yemen, because obviously the only ships that were at risk were those who were docking in Israel or Israeli flagged. Yeah. But by closing off all ships, they're creating the basis that it's some sort of like piracy, or they're attacking everyone, or whatever it may be, which is obviously not the case. So there are some elements of this that do seem to me to be also trying to create this perspective. But nonetheless, it is still, I don't even know if this is real, but I saw someone put up a map, these maritime maps of all the ships, and it was just like hundreds of ships turning around from the Red Sea and going around the Cape of Good Hope because of
incredible
what's happening there. So really, it's a poor country, small country, but extremely dogged and extremely determined to do something. As they said after the U.S. vetoed the ceasefire resolution, the last one, they said our veto is going to be stronger than the U.S.'s veto, God willing. And I think that there's a lot of truth to that.
No, definitely. And, I will note that the U.S. coalition to stop the Yemeni government from doing this. Did you notice that it only included Bahrain, none of the other Arab countries?
There's I think it's from 2011, a cartoon by Carlos Latouf, the famous Brazilian, revolutionary cartoonist, and it's a Bahraini sheik, on his hands and knees, and on his back is the representation of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, a battleship, which says it all. But yeah, only Bahrain, and even some of the other countries seem to be kind of like equivocating. Like Spain was like, well, I mean, we're not really involved. They listed us, but we're not really involved unless maybe the EU gets involved, but we're not really there. France was like, well, we're in the region, but we're not going under the US like umbrella or whatever. So even some of the people who seem to be involved seem afraid to even be known to be involved, probably because, Yemen has also said anyone who gets involved, you're also fair game. And then of course, for the people, the hundreds of millions of people around the world who are in solidarity with Palestine, it just seems, given everything that's happening with the slaughter in Gaza, like what Yemen is doing seems to me to be so obviously like, it makes sense why they're doing it. I'll just put it to you like that. And so to be seen as trying to stop the only country that's like, wow, enough is enough, we're going to do something. I think the PR hit from that has scared a lot of these countries from being listed. And allegedly there's some countries that are participating who told the U.S., don't even list us, don't even mention us, because we don't want anyone to know. So it's interesting. Yemen also said, they said, we've been very patient so far with the Arab countries that have been intercepting our missiles. We've been very patient with them. I guess.
Could you imagine if you invited me to a party and I was like, I might come, but just like don't tell anyone I'm coming. That's kind of what that sounds like.
It is.
Just like don't tell anybody I came. Like no photos. No photos on social media, please.
Nothing. Well, sometimes you got to do that. Let's switch gears here to the U.S. domestic scene. Wow, so many things have happened in 2023 where quite a bit has been happening.
It's like 10 years. And what's that famous quote by...
This is the Lenin quote.
Sometimes, oh wow, we're both a little under the weather.
Yeah.
So we can't remember it.
I can remember it.
What is it? Say it, because I can't.
It's that sometimes there are shit. I don't know. I have to look it up.
I'm going to look it up. Hold on.
And it's also an apocryphal quote. A lot of people think he never said it. It's like with decades when years, or years when decades happen, or something in weeks when decades happen.
There are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen.
Yeah. Well, I don't even really care because it's probably likely he never said it. So it's just
really. You think it's made up? You think somebody made up a Lenin quote?
Yes, that's why it's a widely known apocryphal quote. He probably never said it, but that's okay. That happens all the time.
Why would you take that away from me?
Because I had to. I had no choice, really.
Eugene hates me and he hates Christmas, obviously, because I don't know why else he would do that. I'm just going to keep going with the fact that Lennon absolutely said that. And we're just going to ignore Eugene.
Well, listen, Bethlehem canceled Christmas, so I
Wow. Just because Israel has a war on Christmas doesn't mean we need to.
We're saying Merry Christmas again. All right, let's turn to Amanda Yee, journalist and managing editor of Liberation News. Amanda, thank you so much for being back with us.
Hey, thank you for having me on again. It's great to be back.
Well, it's always an honor to have you here with us. A lot of things happen in the United States alone, just irrespective of the rest of the world.
Yeah.
There's no way we can cover it all, but let's try to hit a few maybe of the bigger notes of things that I thought were super, super notable about the political scene here. I want to first start with the labor movement. We saw the almost Teamster strike, the UAW strike. We've seen so much more. I think the hot labor summer meme, became a thing this year. But it really does seem that the struggle of the working class to have better wages and working conditions saw a big uptick in 2023.
Yeah, for sure. Union activity is up in a major way. It's been a really big year for labor, with 2023 seeing over 300 strikes across the country, involving over, I think, 450,000 workers. And you mentioned it earlier, Eugene, but most notably this year, we saw two really big, really militant labor battles back to back. First was the UPS Teamsters, and the second was the United Auto Workers, those two struggles. So this past summer, the Teamsters had a historic showdown with UPS. They were prepared to strike as their contract was set to expire on August 1st. And in the weeks leading up to the deadline, workers were organizing practice pickets at different UPS hubs across the country and just getting ready to strike. And with 340,000 Teamsters, this would have constituted the largest work stoppage against a single employer in US history, and it really would have brought the economy to a halt. And workers were super militant, they were ready to strike, and UPS was really feeling the pressure. But in the end, the workers and UPS did come to an agreement before their contract, just a few days before their contract expired, actually. And they won really a historic contract. Among the wins included large raises for both part-time and full-time workers, an end to the two-tier system that was added onto the prior contract, as well as, the hiring of 30,000 new full-time positions, as well as air conditioning that would be added to all package trucks purchased within the next year. Then not long after the UPS workers won that contract, the United Auto Workers prepared to take on the big three automakers, right? As their contract was set to expire mid-September, the UAW workers were in negotiations with the big three. The big three are Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis. And this one was really interesting because just before their contract was about to expire, UAW President Shawn Fain announced over a live stream that they were employing what was called a stand-up strike, which means that instead of all the workers going on strike at once, they would only strike several key plans. And those plans would only be announced right before the strike was set to take place. So no one knew which plans would be affected until right before the strike. So each week, tens of thousands of workers would tune in to Shawn Fain's live streams to hear updates from the bargaining table and also to find out which facilities would be targeted. And as the strike continued over the next 6 weeks, the companies had no idea when or where another set of workers would walk off. And this just constantly kept them off balance and without a good strategy to maintain production. So this strategy really gave the workers the upper hand in that they could use the threat of expanding the strike, use that as leverage if companies failed to make progress on negotiations, while at the same time conserving their strike fund. So this escalating strike strategy really increased pressure on the big three automakers. And by mid-November, the union forced the auto companies to an agreement, and they ended up ratifying a new contract with gains that a few months ago would have been unthinkable, right? The gains included major pay increases, increases in pensions into their 401k, and major wins to job security and keeping plants open. So, in both of these labor struggles, when you talk to the workers, they were super disciplined and very clear on who their enemy was. It's really common practice for bosses to try and divide workers and pit them against one another. But in both of these cases, workers were really united in directing their blame onto the CEOs. Like consistently, they would say, UPS can more than afford to pay us better. They made $13 billion in profit last year. Or they say something like, Stellantis can afford to pay us better. We're making them $66 million a day in profit. So really exciting. And, with organization and militancy comes the deepening of political consciousness and the ability to see your struggle as not isolated, but connected to others, not only in the US, but internationally, right? So in the streets, we're seeing more and more labor unions join the protests for Palestine. Earlier this month, the UAW released a statement on Gaza calling for an immediate ceasefire. And not only did this statement call for an immediate ceasefire, but it called to create a working group so that the union could study the history of Palestine and also study the union's economic ties to Israel. So I get the sense that 2023 is just the beginning. We're seeing not only a resurgence of the labor movement, but we're also seeing a renewed militancy of the working class, a renewed internationalism, and I think that's really promising.
It's really important to remember this year. It almost seems like a different era because so much has happened this year. And another thing that happened this year is actually something that you and I discussed on an episode of my show Dispatches, which is McCarthyism Reloaded and the new Cold War on China. Over the last couple of months with Gaza just kind of dominating the headlines, you forget that even happened and is still happening. But actually, the centerpiece of the U.S.'s agenda right now remains great power competition with China, and all of the same elements that were in place when we talked about this last continue to be in place. This Cold War on China, this accusing anybody who's against it of being, an agent of the CCP. Can you talk a bit about that McCarthyism Reloaded, Amanda?
Yeah, 2023 also saw like a major resurgence of McCarthyism. And the US began to escalate its new Cold War on China. I was on earlier this year, we talked about the TikTok hearings where the TikTok CEO testified before a congressional hearing, addressing concerns over the popular social media apps like data collection practices and over concerns that they were sharing data with the Chinese government, which was all false, right? And the hearings, if you remember, they played out as this kind of racist political theater with members of Congress questioning the CEO about whether he had ties to the Communist Party of China, whether he thought China was orchestrating a genocide in Xinjiang, just things that were totally unrelated to TikTok. And what this really was just the latest in the US tech war against China. And it's very similar to its ban on the import of Chinese technology like Huawei, right? And this hysteria over TikTok really has little to do with national security and instead is rooted in fears over a Chinese company threatening US dominance over the tech sector. But it's not only tech firms like TikTok and Huawei that are targets of these McCarthyite attacks. Ordinary Chinese Americans are bearing the brunt of this Red Scare as well, right? Biden has continued the Trump policy of denying Chinese graduate students visas based on whether Chinese universities they attended, based on whatever Chinese universities they attended over their alleged ties to the CPC. Right. This year, we've seen the continued weaponization of what's called the Foreign Agents Registration Act, or FARA, which is basically a public disclosure statute that states if you're working on behalf of the interests of a foreign government, you need to register with the Department of Justice. Otherwise, you're subject to prosecution. But, like I've said before, the problem with FARA is that if you read the statute itself, it's written in a really vague, sweeping manner, and it lends itself to really broad interpretation. And so FARA has been invoked this year to go after tons of Chinese Americans, right? It was invoked to go after Henry Liang in Boston for speaking out against the new Cold War and for advocating peaceful relations between the US and China. In New York City, in Manhattan's Chinatown here, FARA was invoked to crack down on 2 Chinese men on the baseless accusation that they were operating what they called a secret Chinese police station, which authorities alleged was serving as a satellite of the Chinese government to surveil and harass political dissidents living abroad. Now, this wasn't a Chinese police station at all, but it was actually service stations that kind of serve a similar function as a consulate. And they were set up to assist Chinese immigrants with limited English language skills to fill out and process paperwork and renew passports and driver's licenses. But this all just indicates that the US is in political crisis, right? We've got rent skyrocketing, people struggling to afford basic necessities, and these anti-communist witch hunts and this escalating war drive with China are nothing more than a red herring to distract from that, right? And our government would rather spend like huge sums of money on the military preparing for conflict with China and scapegoating Chinese Americans rather than addressing any of these like economic crises.
I'm really glad you made that point there, Amanda, because it does sort of bring me to the next thing I wanted to raise, which is, now we have this kind of unholy alliance, right, with this war funding. We've got Ukraine, money for Israel to continue the genocide, and money to attack China, all rolled into one $100 billion package. As you mentioned, in an economic situation that's terrible for working class people, and on top of that, where the regular quote unquote budget process is just a race to the bottom in terms of cuts of social programs. It really does seem that the old Tupac quote, "They got money for wars but can't feed the poor," maybe it's always true, but it feels especially poignant here at the end of 2023.
Yeah, just last week here in New York City, a 7-story apartment building in the Bronx, it partially collapsed due to structural deficiency. In New York City, the subway system is over a century old, right? Railway infrastructure is also structurally deficient and dangerously underfunded. Bridges are collapsing. Every time we get any kind of heavy rain in New York City, the streets and subways flood because the infrastructure hasn't been updated in decades and they need to be fixed.
Did we lose ourselves?
Oh, I don't know.
Well, trying to figure this out here. Sorry, just give us 1 second.
I think we lost Amanda. She seems to
Okay.
have frozen.
Okay, as long as it's not us.
No, we still
That's-
seem to be moving from what
Okay.
I can see.
Thank you. I'm looking at your screen here. We are moving.
Yeah, we're moving.
Okay, well, she was making a very good point, and I won't editorialize on it because we may be able to get her back about the issue of the infrastructure. But just to, jump back, not really jump back one story, but to make a segue into another story that, probably should be a bigger deal, but it's less of a big deal, is they're actually trying to expand, in addition to FARA, the Section 702 Patriot Act spying. So we're seeing on multiple different levels, and the so-called, crime scare that we're seeing in certain major cities means that, whether we're talking about New York, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, we're seeing a huge increase in terms of the presence of the police using these, totally fact-free methods, if you can even call them that aren't really about addressing crime, but just asserting the power of the state. So, from the top to the bottom, I think that's another aspect is, as the social crises, the geopolitical crises are becoming more acute, and as the ruling elites in the United States are becoming less willing to address them, we're seeing that they're leaning more and more on repressive measures in order to keep a lid on the discontent that we're seeing in the country.
I don't know what you're talking about because all I see when I come to America is freedom and democracy, despite how bad the air quality in the subway system is.
Listen, the freedom to eat out of the trash.
Yeah.
Wow,
that's
true,
a good one.
To beg on the street.
Right?
It's sort of, someone told me this many, many years ago, you have the right to free speech, but you don't have the right to own a newspaper, and the difference between yelling on a corner and owning a newspaper is a big one. And I think that the contradictions of,
So your employer has a right to fire you over what you say, so how much free
in
speech do you really
certain
have?
circumstances, that's why it's important to have a union,
Yes.
in many different ways. But certainly, you have so many different pieces. I think we have Amanda back here. we're gonna welcome her back to the show. Thank you, Amanda. Thanks for coming back. You were just discussing the building collapse in the Bronx.
Oh yeah. Here in New York City, a 7-story apartment building collapsed just a week ago. And this is all part of the, overall infrastructure deteriorating in New York City. Bridges are collapsing. Anytime we get any sort of heavy rain here, the streets and subways flood because the infrastructure hasn't been updated in decades. Of course, we all remember in February, a Norfolk Southern train carrying vinyl chloride and other hazardous materials derailed in East Palestine, Ohio. The story of Norfolk Southern is the story of the rail industry at large, where over the last 4 decades, since 1980, the industry has further and further deregulated and further consolidated. Meanwhile, the railway infrastructure continues to deteriorate while railroad CEOs pocket more and more profits. So, the railway infrastructure itself is dangerously neglected and needs a major overhaul. And we actually have the money to update our infrastructure across the US. It's just a matter of political will. Just last week, Congress passed an $886 billion defense spending bill, which Biden is expected to sign. Since the war in Ukraine began, the US has sent them almost $50 billion in military aid. And this is money that we pay in taxes that is being used to send more weapons to Ukraine, to bankroll Israel's genocide in Gaza. So this is money that we actually have that we could use to update our infrastructure. It could be used to solve the homelessness crisis. It could be used to pay for healthcare for everyone in the country. This is money that exists, but it's just being directed to a very tiny few so that they can afford their luxury lifestyles. Meanwhile, our infrastructure continues to crumble.
Yeah, and I think that brings us to the biggest story of the year that is going to continue, unfortunately, into 2024. Though in some ways, fortunately, when I frame it, which is of course the genocide in Gaza, but specifically the opposition to the U.S.-backed, the Biden-backed genocide in Gaza, which has been huge. I mean, we haven't seen this kind of activism in the streets against war. People are saying since the war in Iraq in 2003. And, it's pretty unprecedented. And it's been, again, 2 months. Now we're actually into month 3 of this genocide, and people haven't relented. So can you talk a bit about that, the opposition we're seeing, not just in the streets, but in the streets and then beyond, against this U.S.-backed genocide?
Yeah, like you said, we're about 3 months into Israel's genocide on Gaza. In this very short period of time, we've seen a mass movement growing in the streets in support of Palestine. These are protests led by grassroots movements, led by Palestinians, led by youth, with anti-imperialism at the very center of its political messaging, right? The people are hitting the streets almost on a daily basis, demanding not only an immediate ceasefire, but also calling for an end to the occupation, and an end to all U.S. funding to Israel. And I think this kind of anti-imperialist messaging can't be co-opted by the liberal establishment and neutralized in a way that we've seen in other movements past, right? And I also think that's why Zionists are kind of freaking out right now and just accusing everything of being anti-Semitism. Biden, meanwhile, has been rushing even more weapons to Israel. In fact, Israel would have run out of weapons and the war would have probably ended in days if it weren't for Biden constantly replenishing their arms supply and sending munitions and bombs to Israel on a near daily basis. And if that weren't enough, in late October, Biden moved to request the removal of all restrictions on all categories of weapons and ammunition from U.S. weapons stockpiles in Israel. So these are stockpiles of weapons stored in Israel that Israel is restricted from accessing but they're there in the event that a regional conflict breaks out. So now Biden is seeking to lift every one of these restrictions and completely curtail congressional oversight and directly transfer this weapon stockpile directly to the IDF. Meanwhile, we're seeing Biden's approval ratings plummet to the lowest it's been since he's taken office. According to a new poll released this past Monday, Biden's approval rating has dropped to just 34%. And in another poll, this one was conducted by the New York Times, only 33% of registered voters approved of his handling of the Gaza war. And this is really stark if you break it down by age group, right? According to the same poll, 72% of registered voters, 18 to 29, disapprove of Biden's handling of the war. In fact, if the election were held today, Trump would win by a 6-point margin. So Gaza is going to be Biden's legacy, and people don't want to vote for him for another term. And they're starting to come to the realization that Israel is completely propped up by the United States. If the U.S. were to draw its aid today, Israel and its military occupation would collapse. And the two of them, the U.S. and Israel, since October 7th, have become more and more isolated on the international stage. This is an indication that Biden is totally out of step, not only with the American people, but pretty much the majority of the world, right? A couple of weeks ago, the UN Security Council voted on a resolution for a ceasefire in Gaza. So 13 out of the 15 Security Council members voted in favor of the ceasefire, while the US just unilaterally vetoed the resolution. Now, the other members of the Security Council are desperately trying to figure out how to draft a new ceasefire resolution written in such a way that the U.S. won't veto. But after that first Security Council vote, the UN General Assembly voted on another resolution for an immediate ceasefire, right? And this time, 153 of the member states voted in favor, with only 10 voting against. And included within that 10, of course, were the U.S. and Israel. So the General Assembly vote, I believe, is non-binding, but it nonetheless shows just how isolated Biden and Israel are, and that the rest of the world stands with Palestine. And the last 2.5, 3 months, they've really revealed, I think, the true nature of Israel and Zionism. And I don't really think there's any turning back from this, right? The people of the world are now waking up to the genocidal nature of Israel. And I really don't think it'll be long, before something has to give and Israel finally falls.
Amanda Yee, journalist and managing editor of Liberation News. As always, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side. Well, Rania?
Well, Eugene, it's been a great year. I'm going to go ahead and take this down since it's just us two now.
Okay.
It's been, I think we've had a great year in terms of being able to use our platform to inform our audience. And I know we have a lot of new people in our audience, so I also want to thank them for subscribing to Breakthrough News. I feel we are very privileged to be at an independent media outlet where we get to be honest about what's happening. And just to give you an example of what I mean by that, I spent the last couple of months obviously in Lebanon where I live. I'm in New York now, visiting for the holidays. But, there was a Reuters correspondent who's Lebanese, who was murdered by the Israelis in a deliberate attack on October 13th. His name was Issam Abdullah. And his outlet, Reuters, wouldn't initially name his killers. They wouldn't name that it was Israel. They were like, we're not sure. We're not sure. And that's all just to say that this is what the corporate media is like.
Yeah.
That when it comes to so many issues, I think that what's taking place in Gaza, all the lies we've seen, all the cover-up we've seen from the corporate media is like an encapsulation of the way they report on everything in the world. It's just a very extreme example. Just going back to the fact that I feel very lucky in 2023 to be at an outlet like Breakthrough News, where I get to tell the truth about what's happening, unabashedly so, with no restrictions on reality. And I think that we're unique in that aspect.
Yeah, no, I think that's true, which is a good time to remind people. You can go to patreon.com/breakthrough news. That's patreon.com/breakthrough news. Become an ongoing donor. We would greatly, greatly appreciate it. But no, I think you're right, Rania, in terms of, what we're able to do. And, this is why we hope for people's support, because there are so many important stories that are relatively controversial or very controversial. And because of that are reported in such a blinkered manner. And I mean, we've been talking all show how much has happened in 2023. I mean, we started the show with the civil war in Sudan, which, by the way, started in 2023, in April of 2023, even though it feels a little bit longer. But I mean, of course, we think about the African continent. I mean, one of the biggest stories we had in Breakthrough in the first half of the year were the uprisings in the Sahel, the so-called, military coups. And that in and of itself, right, of course, was a big topic of discussion for us, was how these weren't really, coups per se. I mean, they were maybe in sort of a formal sense, but they really represented popular uprisings against neocolonialism in these countries. And it continues today. And those three countries, by the way, have formed something called the Alliance of Sahel States. They actually just had their first summit recently. They're coming closer together. What exactly that means, we'll have to see, but saying that they're going to collaborate more militarily, economically, socially. So perhaps the emergence of an interesting Pan-African project. And of course, you go back and watch our coverage of this, there's different contradictions internally in these different spaces. There's a lot of contending forces, like Molly Fee, for instance, who's the Undersecretary of State for Africa. She's actually making a big deal now of how they're working with Niger. She was like, we're talking to Niger, we're working with them, it's going great. They're going to have elections soon. You don't worry about it, it's all fine. But, she said that just a couple days after a top Russian official had left Niamey and signed all these, military agreements. So you can see there's a lot of struggles going on in terms of what this process is going to look like. There are contradictions between some of these governments and some of the popular movements that have supported them. There's all sorts of different realities, different leaders, different things, but nonetheless, a tremendous moment that I think recognizes the breaking of chains of neocolonialism that's starting to happen to a greater degree in Africa. So that was such a huge story in the early part of the year, the first half of the year, and now it almost feels like it was 2 or 3 years ago, but it's continuing, and it's continuing to have a huge impact. And of course, Sudan also in the Sahel, Chad, which is, having, various things happen right now, a referendum and so on and so forth, also in the Sahel. So the Sahel as a region, has really been on fire. Eritrea also, by the way, is in the Sahel. And I was able to travel there this year and do some reporting that no one else in the English language had done, talking to soldiers who had fought in the war in northern Ethiopia, responding to a lot of things, why they fought, what it meant to them, what it means for the region, to their country, and responding to some slanders. So there's been so many different aspects that have happened this year, and I think we've been able to cover them with a unique, lens, because, we don't have whoever pulling the strings. We have you.
Yeah, we have you. We have you, our listeners and viewers who, go to, if you're not a member yet, and you can be, I do encourage you to become a member of Breakthrough News by going to patreon.com/breakthrough news. It's the way to support independent media that's bringing you the truth. And you can also, I love that, Eugene is showcasing, hang on, look. Eugene is showcasing, these are my hands, because we're in the same room. I'm doing the Vanna White. The Vanna White. Eugene is showcasing our awesome merch. This is the Breakthrough News mug. And also, if you become a member, you can access exclusive content from my show Dispatches, as well as other exclusive content. Just in general, I think that this year has really proven why independent media is so important. I mean, a couple other things I just want to note about changes this year.
Please.
My hair color changed a little bit. And also, I've kept it mostly wavy.
Okay.
That's a big change. Going for the natural look.
Okay.
Well, except for the
that.
color part. But
Okay,
you can't have it all.
Close enough.
Can't have it all.
I see in the chat there's a lot of hearts going off when you mentioned that. So I don't know what that means.
I think it's a good color on me.
I think it is a good color.
Thank you. I like the color of your shirt.
But what's important is the audience. The audience likes how you're looking, and that's
what's the most important. But no, I think not to get all corny here, but I think the year 2023 will go down as a very historic, cataclysmic year. It's kind of like a before-after Christ situation when I think of October 7th and what happened that day and what has happened since. I feel like the world has changed and will never go back to the way it was before on so many levels. And I'm proud that we got to produce so much content around this and so many other major issues and transformations across the world this past year, as we kind of emerge into this new multipolar world where the U.S. is being challenged in so many places, as well as other European hegemonic powers.
Yes. Well, listen, we're going to have a lot more on these and whatever topics come up in 2024. So you're watching on YouTube, so make sure you hit subscribe and hit the bell so you can get the alerts for the things you subscribe to, because I promise we're going to have more and more coming here on the Freedom Side and from Breakthrough News in general. We've got a fantastic team behind us. And I just want to say, since our last show of the year, big shout out to Emily Breeze, who is one of the key people who produces this show week to week, to Matt Boleyn on the ones and twos behind the scenes on the technical end on so many different pieces, Jackie Kendall, who plays a huge role in making sure that you can even hear about this show vis-a-vis the work we do on social media, Kay, Craig, Rachel, Chris, John, gosh, I hope I'm not missing anyone because I forgot to write it down. Editor-in-Chief Dr. Ben Becker. I did not forget him. I just want to make sure Rania was paying attention.
Eugene didn't.
Okay, but it's a fantastic team. Everyone here at Breakthrough makes it possible for this show to move forward. Also, huge shout out to David Chung, the super sub, who, whenever we need him, comes off the bench to make sure we don't have to cancel this show due to technical difficulties. So for our entire Breakthrough News team, our entire Freedom Side week-to-week team, we are very, very grateful to all of you for sticking with us here in 2023, and we will see you next year.
Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way.